The storm chased her down the hill long before she reached the chapel. Wind tore through the trees, bending their branches until they creaked like old bones. Her jacket clung to her soaked skin, heavy with rain, and her breath came out in short bursts, more from fear than exertion. She didn't know why her steps carried her toward the abandoned chapel. She only knew she couldn't stay in the house with her thoughts any longer. The air there had begun to feel suffocating, as though the walls had absorbed every unspoken memory she refused to acknowledge. Out here, at least, the storm drowned out her mind. The chapel stood crooked at the end of a forgotten path, its wooden beams warped from decades of neglect. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, sending a hollow echo through the empty space. The smell hit her first: damp stone, rotting pews, and something faintly sweet, like old wax warming under invisible heat. She stepped inside, brushing wet strands of hair away from her face, and felt the temperature drop as the door creaked shut behind her. The storm's roar dulled, replaced by a weighted silence that felt unnatural for a place so abandoned. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light. Water dripped from the broken roof, forming scattered puddles on the floor. A gust of wind rolled through the broken stained glass window, sending a shiver down her spine. She hugged herself, unsure if the cold or the place itself caused the tremor. Then she noticed the altar. A single candle burned at its center. She froze. It made no sense. No one had entered this chapel in years. She knew that. Everyone in town knew that. The roof leak above the altar alone should have drowned a flame instantly. And yet the candle stood there, old, bent, nearly consumed, with a flame that held impossibly still, as though untouched by wind or rain. Her heartbeat stumbled. She blinked hard, convinced her mind was playing tricks, but the flame didn't waver. It stood upright, tense, deliberate, as if acknowledging her presence. She took a tentative step forward. The wood under her shoe creaked, and the sound echoed too loudly, as though the chapel were listening. The flame cracked softly. It wasn't the sound of burning wax. It was something sharper, more intentional, like a whispered syllable escaping someone's lips. She inhaled sharply and stepped closer, keeping her gaze locked on the candle. The air around the altar felt warmer, but not in the comforting, familiar way she remembered from childhood prayers. This warmth carried weight, almost like pressure against her skin. She reached out a trembling hand, stopping inches from the flame. It should have felt hot, but it didn't. The air around it was cool, unsettlingly so, as though the flame drew its heat from somewhere deep within instead of releasing it outward. Her throat tightened. Something about the wick caught her eye. It wasn't a simple twist of cotton. Something darker was woven inside it, something textured, aged, almost fabric-like. She leaned closer, the dim light sharpening around her vision, and noticed faint lines etched across the fibers. These weren't natural patterns. They resembled strokes, as if someone had written directly onto the wick. A chill crept through her spine, but she couldn't pull away. The storm outside surged, and a droplet slipped through the ceiling, falling directly onto the flame. Logic dictated the flame should die. Instead, it flared, illuminating the wick from within, revealing the patterns more clearly. They weren't random marks. They were letters. Her breath caught. Another droplet fell, and the wick responded again, not by shrinking but by loosening. One thin thread pulled away from the rest, rising like a live filament illuminated by the flame. The thread curled upward, glowing faintly, and ink burned through it. She squinted, her pulse hammering in her ears. It was the beginning of a name. Her name. Her skin prickled. A sharp ache spread through her chest, the kind she felt in moments when the past pressed too close. She stumbled back, her hand covering her mouth, refusing to voice the recognition building inside her. She didn't want this. She wasn't ready. She had spent years burying everything connected to that name, to that voice, to that chapter of her life. She wasn't prepared for any of it to surface again. The chapel seemed to tighten around her, as though the walls leaned inward. The thread continued to unspool, shedding more faintly inked fragments. She tried to look away, but the flame brightened, demanding her attention. The pressure in the air deepened, and something warm brushed her cheek, not physically but internally, like a memory brushing against the edge of consciousness. A voice whispered inside her mind, not from the candle, not from the chapel, from within her own memory. A voice she once trusted, a voice she later learned to fear. The temperature shifted, the shadows thickened, her breath shook. She backed away until her shoulder hit the nearest pew. The impact startled her, but didn't break the spell. The thread hung suspended above the flame, swaying even without wind. More ink glimmered along its length. She pressed her palms against the pew, grounding herself in the present, reminding herself that she wasn't trapped in the past. But the flame, stubborn and alive, seemed to disagree. The wick loosened again. More letters surfaced. More fragments of a truth she ran from. She closed her eyes, but the memories pressed harder, pushing against the door she had locked inside herself decades ago. She shook her head, whispering no under her breath, but the chapel absorbed the sound, refusing to let it escape. The flame flickered once, not from the storm, not from her movement, from intention. Her eyes opened, and she understood. Painfully, sharply, certainly, that the candle wasn't staying lit for light. It was staying lit for revelation. The message inside the wick wasn't new, it wasn't mystical, it wasn't divine intervention. It was her own past demanding to be acknowledged. And tonight, the wick would keep unraveling until she faced the truth she thought she had buried forever. The thread hung in the air long after the storm calmed into a dull murmur against the chapel's roof. It hovered with an unnatural steadiness, as though the world were holding its breath along with her. She stepped closer despite every instinct urging her to run. Something about the flame felt both threatening and familiar, like meeting someone she once trusted in a place she wasn't meant to return to. The closer she moved toward the altar, the more the chapel seemed to shrink, as if funneling her toward a truth she had spent most of her life outrunning. The light brightened without growing hotter. It cast long shadows across the walls, stretching toward her feet like reaching hands. She swallowed hard, tasting metal in her throat, that old flavor of fear she thought she had forgotten. The thread continued to unravel, separating from the wick with slow, deliberate certainty. The inked letters on the fragment shifted in the light, revealing more of the word forming across its surface. She didn't want to decipher it. She didn't want to see anything more. But the candle didn't care about her readiness. It cared only about revelation. She reached out again, her hand trembling as she approached the thread, trying to convince herself she could simply pinch it between her fingers and pull it free, severing whatever message the wick carried. But the moment she was close enough to touch it, the flames surged, not toward her but upward, illuminating the next section of the wick. Another fragment loosened, drifting upward like ash caught in a reversed current. The ink on this fragment glowed faintly. Her pulse rose as she recognized the curve of a letter she prayed never to see again. The chapel air thickened with the memory before she could suppress it. A room from her childhood, a razor-sharp whisper, a promise she was forced to make. She shook her head violently, expelling the intrusive image like a poison. She tried focusing on the storm outside, on the cold floor beneath her shoes, on the distant rumble of thunder. Anything to pull her out of the past. But the flame refused to release her. Its crackle grew louder, more insistent, almost rhythmic, as though mimicking a heartbeat that wasn't hers. The candle's light flickered across the altar, catching on something she hadn't noticed before. The base of the candle wasn't smooth like she expected. The wax around the bottom had been carved. She crouched slowly, her knees trembling, and ran a fingertip along the carvings. They were shallow, nearly erased by time, but the shapes were unmistakable, initials. The same initials she etched onto notebooks when she was young. The same initials she prayed would fade from her memory. She recoiled as if burned. But it wasn't pain that pulled her back. It was recognition, not of the initials alone, but of the handwriting, the strokes, the angled lines. She whispered a name under her breath, barely audible, and the flame flared as though acknowledging it. The chapel exhaled around her, a long, low sigh that might have been the wind or something older. She felt it deep in her stomach, the sense of being observed, guided, cornered. She looked at the candle again, and for a moment the flame elongated, straightened, and changed shape in the dim air, just enough to resemble something terrifyingly familiar, the silhouette of a face she once trusted. Her breath shattered. She stepped back until her spine met the cold stone wall. She pressed her palms to the surface, grounding herself in the present, coaxing her mind away from the trapdoor of memory. But the wick kept unraveling. Another thread loosened, another word surfaced. The ink didn't burn away. It revealed itself more clearly, as if growing darker with each second. A whisper followed. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense. It vibrated through her consciousness, emerging like a remembered dream she once tried to forget. A sentence she heard as a child, spoken in a voice that could melt into calmness or terror, depending on its intent. "You remember this, don't you?" The flame moved subtly, bending toward her in a motion that shouldn't have been possible. She blinked rapidly, refusing to accept what she saw, but when she opened her eyes again, the flame held its position, leaning forward like a question. Her knees weakened. She sank onto the nearest pew, elbows on her thighs, hands covering her face. Her breath trembled through her fingers, uneven and shallow. She wasn't ready to remember. She wasn't ready to feel the weight of the voice that once dictated the course of her life. But memories didn't ask permission. They rose when they were starved for acknowledgement. The chapel grew warmer. The scent of wet wax thickened. She inhaled involuntarily, and something inside her cracked open, just enough to let the truth slip through. A hand gripping her wrist. A whisper in a dark hallway. A promise forced upon her. A candle lit every night for a year. Her stomach tightened as the past bled into the present. She looked back at the flame, and for a moment the room blurred. The candle wasn't just a candle. It was a memory reconstructed in wax, a ritual she used to perform under instruction, a symbol loaded with meaning she hadn't dared unpack. Another thread loosened. It drifted upward, hovering near the flame before unraveling completely. The inked letters on it were unmistakable now. They formed a single word, a word she hadn't spoken in 20 years. Enough. The wick began to glow at its core, and the flame curled inward, as though pulling something from deep within the candle. A hum filled the chapel, low and vibrating, almost like the droning note of a distant organ. Her skin tingled. Every hair on her arm stood on end. She didn't understand how she knew, but she knew. The candle was no longer revealing the past. It was demanding something, not understanding, not forgiveness, not nostalgia, confrontation. The flame swayed once more, pointing toward her like an accusing finger, and in that silent, impossible gesture she understood the real message. Memory wasn't returning to torment her, it was returning to free her, but only if she was willing to stand in front of the truth she had run from her entire life. She stayed seated on the pew longer than she realized, her body hunched over, hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles ached. The chapel felt suspended in time. The storm outside no longer sounded like weather. It sounded like background noise to something older, something that had been waiting underneath her skin for decades. The candle's flame continued to glow at the center of it all, unwavering, patient, as if it knew she would eventually look up again. When she finally raised her head, the flame had changed. It was thinner now, stretched higher, its tip trembling as though it were reaching toward the ceiling. The wick glowed an unnatural shade at its core, bright enough that the inside of the candle seemed hollow, as if something inside had burned away to make room. Threads still hung loosely above it, carrying letters she tried not to sound out in her mind. The sensation of being watched hadn't faded. It had only grown more focused. She exhaled slowly, feeling her chest tighten. "What do you want from me?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Her voice sounded foreign in the chapel, thinner and smaller than she intended. The flame reacted instantly, bending in her direction as if acknowledging the question. No breeze had entered. The air wasn't moving, yet the flame bowed like a living thing. She swallowed, heat rising behind her eyes. She knew better than to frame this as something mystical. She had spent years teaching herself not to attribute meaning to signs, not to trust spiritual interpretations. There had been a time when she believed too easily, a time when someone used her faith against her. She refused to return to that vulnerability. And yet, here she was, speaking to a candle like it carried the voice she never wanted to hear again. The wick responded not with words, but with memory. The chapel darkened at the edges of her vision, as though the light were pulling away from the walls and concentrating around the altar. Shadows thickened. The flame brightened. For a moment, she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The smell of the present, the wet stone, the damp wood, faded under a different scent entirely. Wax, new, unsullied wax. And something, incense, faint and familiar. She was no longer seated on the pew in her mind. She was 13, standing in a cramped room with peeling wallpaper, her fingers wrapped around a cold brass candlestick. The memory rose with such clarity that her body reacted before her thoughts did. Her shoulders tensed, her jaw clenched, her heart began to race in a pattern she recognized even after all these years. In the chapel, she whispered, "No." But her mind didn't listen. The past had already opened. She saw the old bedroom, narrow, dim, lit only by the candle she held at chest height. Shadows crawled along the ceiling, rippling each time the flame shivered. The voice behind her was soft but sharp, the way it always was when it mattered most. "Hold it steady," he said. "If the flame breaks, the promise breaks." Her younger hands tried not to shake. The candle felt heavier than it should have, its base too large for her grip. She swallowed, staring straight ahead at the small table where a Bible lay open, its words blurred by the glow. The room smelled like incense and cold metal. The window was closed, yet she felt watched, from above, from beyond, from behind. "Repeat it," the voice instructed. Back in the chapel, her adult fingers curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. She did not want to hear the rest. The pressure in her throat intensified, as though someone's hand were resting there, not choking her, but reminding her of how easily they could. The candle flame in front of her trembled once, pulling her attention back to the present. And yet the two moments, then and now, began to overlap. The candle on the altar and the candle in that room were no longer two separate images. They were one, superimposed, burning through time. Her 13-year-old voice echoed through her mind. "I promise," the younger version whispered, "I will never speak against you. I will never question you. I will never tell anyone what happens here." The older version of her flinched as though struck. In the memory, the man stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the light on the wall. "Good girl," he murmured. His hand settled on her shoulder, deceptively gentle. "This candle will remind you, as long as the flame stays pure, your loyalty stays pure." If it dies because of you, you know what that means." The girl nodded, teeth pressed together so hard her jaw ached. In the chapel, she opened her eyes fully, the memories snapping into sharp focus. The present felt tilted, off balance, as if the floor had shifted a few degrees without moving. Her heart pounded in her ears. She stared at the altar, at the candle that refused to die under the rain, and saw it now for what it was. Not just an object, but a symbol of the vow she made under fear. A vow that never truly ended. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You don't own me anymore." The words were quiet, but the impact inside her was violent. It felt like something ripped. The flame shot higher, flaring white for a split second before settling into a steadier burn. More threads of the wick loosened, curling upward in thin spirals. Each thread carried ink that glimmered and darkened as she watched. The letters on them weren't random anymore. They were phrases. You promised. You stayed silent. You obeyed. Her stomach twisted. For years she had convinced herself that what happened then was simply confusion, spiritual manipulation, a misunderstanding she could file under the category of past mistakes. But seeing the words burned into the wick, watching them rise from the very core of the candle, made denial impossible. This wasn't just a memory, it was documentation. She stepped toward the altar again. Her hands still shook, but there was something different in her movement now, a thin line of resistance, a crack of defiance. The air thickened, pressing against her as if the chapel itself were testing her resolve. She reached her hand toward the flame once more, expecting the coolness she had felt before. This time it was warm, not blistering, not painful, just warm enough to remind her what real fire felt like. She held her hand over the wick, ignoring the instinct to flinch. A tremor ran through her arm, but she did not move away. The flame bent toward her palm. For a moment, she had the irrational sense that it wanted contact, like a pulse reaching for another pulse. The warmth spread through her hand, up her wrist, into her chest. Her eyes stung, but she didn't look away. The threads continued to unravel, each one lighter than the last, as if the candle were exhausting its supply of silence. "I was a child," she whispered. "You made me carry what wasn't mine." The flame wavered, not collapsing but reacting. A crack sounded from within the wax, like something fracturing deep inside. The candle base shifted slightly, softening, melting faster around the carved initials. The wax began to drip down the sides in uneven streams, erasing parts of the letters as it fell. She watched, breath held, as the initials blurred, then distorted, then partially disappeared beneath the flow of softened wax. For the first time since she entered the chapel, she felt the smallest hint of something unfamiliar when she looked at the candle. Not just fear, possibility. The wick glowed a final time, releasing one last thread that carried a phrase, clear as if spoken aloud. "You can break this." Her throat closed. Tearful heat rose behind her eyes. She blinked hard, refusing to let them fall just yet. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't healing. It wasn't even closure. It was the first time in her life that the past looked like something she could actually confront, instead of something destined to control her forever. And as the last thread lifted from the wick and dissolved into the air, she realized something else. For the first time, the candle wasn't the only thing refusing to go out. The warmth in her palm lingered long after she pulled her hand away from the flame. It sat beneath her skin like a quiet ember, not painful, not overwhelming, just present. A small, insistent reminder that something had shifted. For the first time since she'd stepped into the chapel, the air didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a threshold. She straightened slowly, shoulders tight, breath still uneven. The candle's flame had returned to its earlier shape, small and steady, no longer flaring in protest or stretching toward the ceiling. The threads had stopped unraveling. The wick, though visibly thinner, held firm. The carved initials at the base were half buried now beneath dripped wax, distorted into shapes that no longer made immediate sense. She stared at them, realizing she could no longer read the name with the same clarity she once did. That realization unsettled her more than she expected. For years, his name had been sharp in her mind, crisp, inescapable, like a word etched into glass. Now, under a few fragile streams of melted wax, it was blurred. Not gone, not erased, but changed. Less permanent, less invincible. She stepped back from the altar and turned toward the pews, needing distance, needing air that hadn't brushed that flame. Her legs wobbled beneath her, the residue of adrenaline making every movement feel both too light and too heavy at once. She lowered herself back onto the wooden bench, pressing her hands flat on either side of her, anchoring herself to something solid. The chapel was still. The storm outside had softened into a steady rainfall like a quiet backdrop. The silence inside no longer felt suffocating, it felt occupied, filled with the echoes of what she had finally allowed herself to remember. "I was a child," she repeated under her breath, testing the sentence in the air. It didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like a fact she had been forbidden to acknowledge. She had carried the guilt as if the promises were hers alone to protect. As if breaking them made her the betrayer, the unfaithful one, the problem. That was how he taught her to think. That loyalty meant silence, obedience, and enduring whatever came, so long as the candle stayed lit. For years, she didn't realize the candle was never meant to test her devotion to God. It tested her devotion to Him. Her jaw tightened. She closed her eyes and saw the room again. The first night of that ritual, the way the shadows had towered over her, the way his voice had braided scripture with control. He taught her that questioning him meant questioning God, that resistance was rebellion, that fear was proof she still needed saving. She swallowed hard, the memory scraping as it moved through her. Back then, the candle felt like a judge. Now, for the first time, it felt like a witness. She opened her eyes and looked at it again. The flame glowed in the distance, no longer looming but still undeniably present. If anyone else walked into the chapel at that moment, they would likely see nothing more than an old candle stubbornly burning through a storm. Only she knew what it already had revealed. Only she knew what it was unraveling inside her. A thought slipped through her mind so quietly at first that she nearly missed it. What if this isn't about punishment? What if this is about evidence? Evidence that she was never making it up. Evidence that what happened in that house, in that small room with the Bible and the candlestick, was not her imagination or teenage confusion. Evidence that the weight she carried for decades did not come from weakness or dramatization, but from real harm she was never allowed to name. Her lips parted as a new, tentative awareness rose in her chest. He taught her that silence was holiness, but what if it had always been self-preservation for him? The flame flickered once, as though punctuating the thought. Her breathing steadied, if only slightly. She leaned back against the pew, the wood unforgiving but grounding. For the first time in years, she did not rush to shut down the memory. She let it sit, not to relive every detail, not to drown in it, but to see it clearly. As if she were finally allowed to observe it from the outside instead of being trapped inside it. She remembered the pattern of those nights. Light the candle, hold it steady, repeat the promise, ignore the twisting in her stomach, accept the words he fed her as divine, tell no one, tell no one, tell no one. Her throat ached as she recalled the one time, just once, when she almost broke. She had been 14. The candle that night had sputtered halfway through the ritual, its flame shrinking under an unnoticed draft. For a brief moment, it nearly died. Her heart had leapt, not from fear, but from a raw, wild hope she didn't understand. Maybe this is it. she remembered thinking. Maybe this means I don't have to keep doing this. But he noticed. He shielded the flame with his hand, whispering something she couldn't fully hear, and it flared back to life. Afterward, he called her careless. Told her she wasn't committed enough. Told her that if the flame ever truly went out, after everything he had poured into her soul, it would be her fault alone. She wore that threat for years like a brand. Now, watching this candle, the one that refused to die even under rain, even under her breath, even under her trembling fingertips, she felt something inside her quietly rebel. He didn't own the flame. He never did. He just weaponized it. She exhaled, a slow, unsteady breath that felt like the first voluntary movement she'd made in hours. She glanced at the cracked windows. The rain outside had softened into a steady curtain, blurring the world beyond the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Faint, almost imperceptible. She couldn't tell if it was real or memory. Either way, it pulled her attention toward a different line of thought. When did she stop praying honestly? Not the kind of prayer he demanded, those recitations, those rehearsed phrases meant to prove surrender, but the kind that came from her, without fear of being corrected. The kind of prayer that sounded like truth instead of performance. She couldn't remember. The realization hurt more than she expected. She looked back at the candle. If this is about truth, she said quietly, then it can't just be about what he did. It has to be about what I've done to myself since. She had carried the burden of what happened by refusing to look at it directly, by minimizing it, by spiritualizing it away, by calling it confusion, immaturity, misunderstanding, anything but what it really was. Exploitation disguised as faith. The flame remained still, but its presence pressed gently against her thoughts, urging her to continue. She stared at it, heart heavy yet oddly open. I stayed silent, she admitted. I helped him by staying silent, even after I left, even as an adult. I told myself it wasn't that bad, that other people had it worse, that I should let it go. Her voice broke slightly around the last words. Let it go had always meant don't name it. Naming it felt dangerous, final, real. But she was starting to understand that leaving it unnamed had tied her to it more tightly than anything else. She took another breath. Her chest felt tight, but not crushing. More like it was stretching against old constraints, testing how far it could expand. This is the first crack, she thought. Not in her faith, not in her sanity, but in the silence that kept everything locked in place. She didn't yet know what it would mean to speak, to call it what it was, to acknowledge, out loud in full, that what happened to her in that room was not spiritual guidance. It was spiritual abuse. The words did not yet leave her mouth, but they formed cleanly in her mind. The flame moved then, not violently but decisively, bending toward her one last time. The wick glowed at its center, and she watched, transfixed, as a small piece of it finally broke off and fell. It did not extinguish. The flame adjusted, smaller, but still alive. She realized with a start that she was no longer afraid of it. For the first time, the candle symbolized something else entirely, the possibility that she could remember without being destroyed by the remembering. That she could walk back into the places she swore to avoid and leave them under her own power this time. The past had not vanished. The harm was not erased. But the idea that it must remain in the dark, sealed in silence, had finally taken its first hit. And as she sat there, in a chapel that should have been forgotten, watching a candle that should have gone out hours ago, she knew one thing with a clarity that both scared and steadied her. There would be no healing without naming. And there would be no going back to who she pretended to be before this night. The rain eased into a whisper outside, the kind of whisper that felt like an invitation rather than a warning. She remained on the pew longer than she intended, her breathing finally settling into something closer to control. The candle still burned at the altar, steady and patient, but something about the flame was different now. It didn't command her attention the way it had before. Instead, it waited, quiet, expectant, almost respectful. She stood slowly, the wooden bench creaking beneath her weight. Her legs felt strange, as if they belonged to someone who had walked a much longer distance than she had. The ember-like warmth that lingered in her hand had spread subtly up her arm, settling somewhere just beneath her collarbone. Not heat, not pain, just presence. A reminder that something old had shifted and something new had begun. She walked toward the altar again, but this time her steps were deliberate, grounded, not pulled by fear or confusion. She studied the candle, the softened wax, the half-erased initials, the thin wick that looked frayed but somehow stronger. The flame didn't rise to meet her, it didn't bend. It simply held its shape, as though honoring a boundary she had finally earned the right to set. "You don't control me anymore," she whispered. Not to the candle, not even to the man whose voice had carved itself into her memory. She said it to the echo of the fear that had lived inside her for too long. The flame flickered, not in protest, but in agreement. She exhaled, a long breath that tasted like something leaving her, something old, something heavy. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed something she hadn't before, a small door, almost hidden behind the left side of the altar. Its wood was darker than the rest of the chapel and smoother, as if it had been opened and closed many times before the world forgot about this place. A pulse of unease slid through her. The candle's flame seemed to dim slightly, not warning her, but acknowledging her attention shift. The chapel floor beneath her felt colder as she approached the door. She didn't know why she moved toward it. She didn't even know what she expected to find. But the silence around her changed as she reached out, tightened, sharpened, thickened, as if the chapel itself were inhaling. Her fingers brushed the handle. Cold, not the kind of cold that came from metal left untouched for years. A deeper cold, the cold of something that wanted to stay closed. She pulled her hand back instinctively. The candle crackled behind her, a short, sharp sound that cut through the silence. She turned toward it. The flame hadn't changed shape, but its light reached farther now, spilling across the floor toward her feet as if pushing her forward. She swallowed hard. "I don't need to open it." The silence disagreed. She felt it, not as pressure, not as fear, but as truth. There were moments in life when the body recognized a threshold before the mind understood it. Standing before that hidden door, she felt the same sensation she felt years ago in that small room with the first candle, the sense that the next step would mark her forever. Only this time, the choice belonged to her. She hesitated, her breath shaking. The memory of that room rose again, the dim light, the command to hold the flame steady, the vow she made out of fear rather than devotion. That vow had built a door inside her long before she ever found this one. Maybe this wasn't a door in the chapel at all. Maybe it was the one she never opened in herself. She turned her palm upward, watching the soft glow that still pulsed beneath her skin from touching the flame earlier. Strength didn't feel like confidence, it felt like permission. She nodded a small, trembling gesture and reached for the handle again. This time she pulled. The door opened with a slow, heavy groan. Dust stirred from the darkness within, drifting into the thin stream of candlelight behind her. She leaned forward, letting her eyes adjust. The space beyond the door wasn't large, barely a storage closet, but it wasn't empty. A wooden box sat in the center, its lid cracked but intact. A thin layer of dust coated it except for the edges, which looked oddly clean, as if touched recently. Her stomach tightened. She stepped inside, careful, breath shallow. The air in the small space was colder, but it carried a faint scent she recognized instantly. Wax, but not the scent of the candle on the altar. This wax was different, warmer, sweeter, unmistakably familiar. Her heart thudded. She crouched in front of the box, fingers trembling as she pushed the lid fully open. The hinges protested with a soft rustle. Inside, neatly arranged despite age, were objects wrapped in cloth. She reached for the first item, unraveling the fabric slowly. A candlestick. Brass, cold, heavy. The same type as the one she held as a girl. Her throat tightened. She set it aside gently and reached for the next bundle. The cloth fell away to reveal a Bible. Thin, worn, its cover cracked along the spine. She opened it with hesitant fingers. There, highlighted faintly, was the same verse he made her read aloud the night she made the vow. The verse about obedience, submission, silence. She closed it quickly, as if the words might reach out and reclaim her. Her chest heaved once, a silent sob trapped somewhere between release and paralysis. She placed the Bible down and reached for the last object. It was wrapped more tightly than the others, like someone had been careful, almost reverent. The cloth fell away, and she froze. Inside was a candle, not like the one burning on the altar, not weathered or warped. This candle was new, unused, unlit. Its wick was braided, deliberate, intricate, unmistakably human. Ink-stained parts of the braid, words. Not entire sentences, not vows, but beginnings of them. She recognized the handwriting. She swallowed, voice nearly breaking. He left this here, not as remembrance, as continuation. The realization crawled through her blood, unsettling, terrifying, clarifying. He had expected her to return someday, or he had expected someone to find this and continue the ritual. Maybe he believed he still had a hold somewhere. Maybe parts of him lived inside the rituals he created, waiting for another host. But the candle on the altar had chosen differently. It hadn't burned to honor his vow. It burned to expose it. The new candle in her hands felt deceptively light. She stared at it. The inked wick, the braided fibers that carried the intention of a man who once shaped her life. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. She stood and stepped back out of the small room, the candle still in her grip. When she emerged into the chapel again, the flame on the altar flickered sharply, as if responding to what she had found. She approached it, heart pounding. "You wanted me to see this," she said softly, "not to remember him, to remember that I never chose any of it." The flame bowed, her breath caught. She placed the unlit candle beside the burning one on the altar. The contrast between them was stark, past and present, control and exposure, vow and truth. She took one step back, then another. The flame of the original candle leaned toward the unlit one. A subtle movement, a suggestion. She understood the implication instantly. "No," she whispered. "I won't light it. I won't continue what he started." The flame straightened. It didn't insist. It didn't bend again. It simply held its stance, as though waiting for her to choose something on her own terms. She closed her eyes and exhaled. "This ends with me." When she opened them again, the flame dimmed, pulsed once, and returned to its steady burn, as if acknowledging the first decision she had made in years that belonged entirely to her. But the candle still burned, and the wick still held something she had not yet seen. The night was far from over. By the time she stepped away from the altar, the night had deepened into that quiet hour when the world feels between breaths. The rain outside had nearly stopped. Only a soft drip remained, like the sky was reluctant to let go completely. The chapel felt different now, not less haunted, just more honest, as if the walls weren't trying to hide what they'd seen anymore. The two candles stood together at the center of the altar. One burned low, its wax spilling over the carved base, its wick thinner, its flame steady and faintly golden. The other remained untouched, its braided wick marked by ink, waiting to be claimed or rejected. She watched them both, feeling the strange, calm weight of choice in her chest. For years she had been guided by someone else's voice, someone else's script, someone else's idea of faith and obedience. Tonight, for the first time, no one spoke but her. She moved to the front row, close enough to feel the glow on her face, but far enough to see the scene as a whole. The chapel, the altar, the two candles, the rain-streaked windows, the shadows. If someone had shown her this moment a year ago, she might have thought it was a story about a miracle. Now she understood it was about something quieter, stranger, and infinitely more powerful. A woman finally stepping out of a role she never agreed to play. Her hands relaxed on her knees. She felt tired, but not in the way she'd felt tired for years, not the soul-crushing exhaustion of carrying a secret no one else could see. This, tired, was physical, human, earned. The kind that comes after finally telling the truth to yourself and realizing you survived it. She thought about all the years she had filled her mind with distraction, work, noise, content, stories about success and manifestation and the lives of other people. A millionaire here, a redemption story there, testimonies of prosperity and abundance that were easier to consume than her own unfinished narrative. She had believed healing would come from changing everything outside her, income, relationships, geography, habits. And yet here she was, in a forgotten chapel, realizing the real turning point was not external. It was this, looking directly at the wound she'd been circling her entire life and choosing not to turn away. "Divine timing," she whispered, and for once the phrase didn't feel like a cliché. Not like something printed on a mug or buried in a self-help book. It felt like a quiet, unsettling fact. She could have found this chapel years ago. She could have walked in and seen nothing but decay. But tonight, with all her years of silence stacked behind her like unlit candles, she was finally ready to see what burned underneath. She stood again and walked back to the altar, the wood floor creaking softly beneath her feet. The flame greeted her without movement, simply existing. No more theatrics, no more flares, just steady fire, small but undeniable. The wick had given almost everything it had. It would not last much longer, and for the first time that didn't frighten her. She rested her fingertips on the edge of the altar. "You were never here to scare me, were you?" she murmured. "You were here to show me I wasn't crazy." Memories washed over her, but now they moved differently. They didn't crash. They unfolded. The room with the first candle, the weight of the vow, the manipulation dressed as holiness. The threat that if the flame died, so would something in her. And the years that followed, where she kept lighting candles in different forms, rigid religiosity, perfectionism, constant self-blame, trying to prove she was still pure, still loyal, still worthy of love. It hit her with almost physical clarity. He had taught her that her value depended on silence and sacrifice. But standing here, heart raw and mind clearer than it had been in years, she felt a different truth rise like a quiet tide. Her worth had never been his to measure. She reached out to the burning candle one more time, pausing just before the flame. The warmth brushed her skin, gentle, like the touch of something that no longer needed to demand anything from her. She thought of all the prayers she had whispered over the years, asking for signs, direction, some dramatic manifestation of God's will. Now, in the simplest possible way, she understood. Some answers don't come as voices from heaven. Some answers come when you finally stop lying to yourself. She straightened her shoulders. "I'm not keeping this vow," she said softly. "Not anymore. Not to him. Not to his version of God. Not to the story where I'm always the one at fault." There was no thunder. No earthquake. No audible response, only a subtle shift inside her, like a knot that had been tightening for decades, finally loosening by a fraction. It wasn't redemption in the flashy sense she'd seen in other people's testimonies. It was something quieter, slower, but just as sacred. She looked at the unlit candle beside the burning one. Its presence felt different now, not like a trap waiting to be sprung, but like an unfinished sentence she could refuse to complete. The inked wick, once threatening, now looked almost fragile. His handwriting no longer felt like a brand, just marks on wax. "I'm not lighting you," she said to it. "You don't get another life through me." The decision was simple, final, solid. She picked up the new candle, walked back to the small hidden room, and placed it gently inside the box. Not as an offering, not as evidence against herself, as proof she had found it, looked at it, and chosen not to continue its purpose. Then she closed the lid, not sealed, just closed. When she stepped back into the chapel, something had shifted in the way she saw the space. It wasn't a haunted sanctuary anymore. It was a place where things had been hidden, and where things had been revealed. A place where she could return, if she wanted, on her own terms, or never come back, and still carry what she needed from this night. She approached the altar, one last time. The flame had shrunk, but it still stood upright, stubborn in its final stretch of life. She understood now that this candle had done what it came to do. It had revealed, it had confronted, it had witnessed her finally telling the truth. There was only one thing left for it to do. And that part, she realized, was her choice too. For years, the idea of a candle going out terrified her because he tied it to punishment. Failure. A curse. Now she saw a different meaning. Sometimes a flame doesn't die because it was weak. Sometimes a flame goes out because its work is done. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled over the wick, not as a test, not in panic, but with calm intent. The flame trembled, pulled tight, and then disappeared into a thin ribbon of smoke curling into the air. Silence filled the chapel. Nothing collapsed. No darkness swallowed her. The air felt the same, and completely different. The smoke rose, then dissipated, leaving only the faint scent of extinguished wax and something else beneath it. Relief. She placed her hand flat on the altar and closed her eyes. No ritual, no scripted prayer, just a simple sentence spoken into the quiet. God, if you were ever there, then you saw everything, and you know this was never mine to carry. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed, firm and clear, in the space between her and whatever still waited beyond understanding. She didn't know what her faith would look like after this. Not the cleaned-up version, not the fearful version, the real one. But for the first time, she was willing to find out. She walked to the chapel door, her steps lighter than when she had entered. When she pushed it open, the outside air greeted her, cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant hint of dawn. Night was still holding on, but the horizon showed the faintest suggestion of light. She turned once more to look inside. The altar stood in the half-dark, no flame, no spectacle, just wax cooling into its final shape. The candle that wouldn't go out had finally been allowed to rest, not in defeat, in completion. She understood something then, quiet and deep. The real miracle was never that the candle refused to die. The real miracle was that she finally stopped dying with it. She stepped out into the soft, uncertain morning, the echo of her own realization following her like a shadow she no longer feared. The candle that wouldn't go out had never been about fire. It had always been about her.